My name is Lakshmi Paruri. I'm the venture director at Pillsbury Law Firm, and I'm really pleased to share the stage here with Dr. Atul Butte. I'm just going to start out doing an intro for you. There's a long list of achievements here, so I'll just sort of concentrate on the main points. But Dr. Butte is currently the chief of the Division of Systems Medicine and associate professor of pediatrics medicine and, by courtesy, computer science at Stanford University and Lucile Packard Children's Hospital. He trained in computer science at Brown University, worked as a software engineer at Apple and Microsoft, and then received his MD at Brown again, trained in pediatrics and pediatric endocrinology at Children's Hospital Boston. And then, after all that, he received his PhD in health sciences and technology from Harvard Medical School and MIT. So it's quite a resume there. And he currently has authored more than 100 publications and delivered more than 120 invited presentations in personalized and systems medicine and bioinformatics and a number of other areas. So welcome, and thanks for being here. You're obviously a bit of a renaissance person in academia, and you've come full circle, and you're in one of the biggest areas now of the nexus of healthcare and big data or medical research. Can you tell us a little bit about that journey and why you chose it, and what your current role at Stanford entails? Yeah, so, this is a large audience, so I'm guessing most people here are still in the IT field, and they're interested in healthcare. That's why you're in this room. I think my own personal journey into this field started back in high school, elementary school. The typical kid growing up here who has some South Asian background is exposed to being either an engineer or a doctor, and why not do both? And in the end, what I learned along the way, and maybe the lesson learned, is that obviously if you train deep in any one field, of course you're going to get hired. Of course you're not going to have any trouble getting a job. If you train deep in two fields, you become world unique. And I think that's going to be the goal for maybe us, maybe our kids. Training in just one field isn't good enough anymore. It's just not. And whether it's medicine and computer science and something else, fill in the X and the Y. When you train in both, that's where then you are not easily outsourced. You're the one who's making decisions. You're the one who people go after. So that's a lesson I learned along the way. The other point I want to make, too, is that, I guess I spent 35 years in school. I think this kind of traditional, at least Indian professional belief is that you go through education and then you end, and then you start in the workforce. I think that is going to have to go away. We're entering this world of lifelong learning. We certainly have MOOCs and online courses. So it's not always about the fastest way through your education anymore. I don't know if that answers your question. Sure. So let's talk a little bit about the role at Stanford, and what is Chief of Systems Medicine, and what sort of context can you put that in a larger area of bioinformatics? Yeah, so obviously if we have a TiE session on data and healthcare, obviously it's a no-brainer. We're in this data-driven revolution of health and healthcare. This is all data-driven. There's two particular data drivers right now in healthcare, okay, and it's worth just illustrating both. The first is in the molecular or the genome space. So if you haven't heard, we can get genome sequences on people. What is the Genome Project? The easiest way to think about it is a recipe book. Think about the joy of cooking. Everyone has the joy of cooking at home. We love the joy of cooking. We never even open the book to follow the recipes, but it looks good in the kitchen. Imagine 4,000 copies of the joy of cooking. That's how many letters are in the genome, in your DNA, and that's in every one of your cells. And now we have all of those letters spelled out. That's, by the way, 2 Statues of Liberties tall, just in terms of books. That's the Genome Project. It took $3 billion to get the Genome Project done, and 13 years. It ended in 2003. And now the current price is down to about $1,000, okay? $1,000. And the current record is we can complete a genome in 27 hours, okay? There are hospitals that when a baby's born, we're not sure what's going wrong with this baby. You can get a genome back in 27 hours. And just be mindful, again, that's down from $3 billion and 13 years in 2003. This is much faster than Moore's Law. If we were just following Moore's Law, we would be thrilled to pay $5 million per genome right now. We'd be thrilled. And then you have to wonder, all the revolutions we see around us that Moore's Law launched, whether it's internet, mobile, Facebook, Google, whatever you can put your finger on, right? Can we imagine even a fraction of those happening because the DNA price is dropping like this? Right? We're down to $1,000 now. By the end of this decade, we'll be down to $30. And what happens the next year when it hits $30? The next year it hits $0. And what happens the next year after it's $0? It hits negative dollars.
What's a negative dollar genome? Well, we start to think ahead and realize, can we imagine, you know, there are actually car insurance companies today that will, if you agree, they will send you this little gadget you put underneath your dashboard. And if you agree to monitor the GPS and let them have their GPS tracking and your braking and your acceleration, they will cut your car insurance rates if you don't drive like a maniac. Can we imagine some healthcare institution doing this in 10 years, 5 years? I'm not saying in our lifetime, I'm saying in the next 10 years. So the biggest data driver right now is going to be the genome and the molecular. I always have a prop just to make sure everyone gets focused. Data seems ethereal. I like to hold up my little chip. This is a chip for a company called Affymetrix. I have no financial connection with them. They're literally here in Santa Clara. It looks like an Intel chip because they're right next to Intel, of course. You know, I got my start in this field by I had 60 of these precious chips about 10 years ago to do my research. Not only are these down to about $100 to $200, but now the next data driver, which we'll talk about, is that we have to share this data, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So the biggest data driver is the molecular. The second point I want to make, just count the billions. Where are the billions going? Billions in the molecular, billions in clinical data being captured. We all know about electronic health records. We know Cerner, we know Epic. And if it's not clear to people, hospitals spend hundreds of millions of dollars each to put in these systems, okay? Hundreds of millions, and then when they're not happy with the first system, they spend hundreds of millions more to put in the competition system, okay? I think Kaiser, of course, spent billions putting their system in. So these are billions into a healthcare IT space. Of course, the data is being collected, and you just have to wonder, so what do we do with any random byte of data that we're collecting there? We do nothing with that byte of data. It's a whole downstream utility that just still has to be created. So our division at Stanford is really like a data-driven revolution in health and healthcare. We're hiring new faculty. We just hired one amazing guy, Dennis Wall. Just to give you an example, what happens when you have a child and you think your child has autism today. It takes about 6 to 12 months just to get the appointment with a pediatric neurologist today. That's unacceptable. That's unacceptable. What he started to realize is that parents put videos of their kids on YouTube. Right? And actually, they share it with family, but they also ask other family and friends, do you think my child has autism? Well, Dennis Wall figured out he could train folks and get them to accurately diagnose these kids just using YouTube videos. So instead of 6 to 12 months, we're talking 6 to 12 hours. And what's the advantage there is that we can get at least some behavioral therapy, some kind of occupational therapy to make a difference earlier in a kid's life. So those are kind of faculty we imagine hiring at Stanford.
And you talk a little bit, you mentioned the utility downstream. I know in a lot of your past talks you talked about the various applications here like diagnostic testing and risk assessment. And there was a very interesting landmark case of a 4-year-old boy named Nicholas Volker. Yeah. And wanted you to maybe talk about that a little bit and then give us an idea of how far we've come and where we're going. Yeah, so Nicholas Volker, if you've never heard the story, it's a Pulitzer Prize winning story. It comes out of the Children's Hospital in Milwaukee. And it's a great story to just Google up afterwards. This just really is a great illustration of how fast things move. So we're talking about 4 years ago. This is a 5-year-old child who literally lived in the hospital. He already had more than 100 surgeries for his bowels because he was slowly killing off his intestines. And he lived in the hospital. There was no way he could even think about a regular diet or even going to school. And this child was going to die. And what happened is they sequenced the child's genome, they sequenced the parents, and they realized that this child has a misspelling, a different spelling in one of those letters in all of those recipe books, okay, one of those genes. And that was enough. When they saw what this recipe was good for, they said, well, it seems to do something with the immune system. So let's put in a new immune system. We do a bone marrow transplantation. And this child now goes to school and eats a regular diet. He is out of the hospital. And all of this happened, not 10 years ago, 3 years ago. And now we at Stanford and many other major children's hospitals see dozens of these children because it is the case that we have a lot of patterns. We know how to do pattern recognition, but sometimes kids show up and they're the first in the world to have this disease. And now it used to be 100 kids before you could figure out what the misspelling was. Then you needed 10, and now we can do it just one child and the parents. We can figure out what's going on. We have a long way to go to be able to offer something in terms of medicine for these kinds of children, but at least it helps the parents find each other. There have been a lot of these stories you might have seen in CNN, the child that doesn't cry. There were a couple of these that Stanford was involved with as well, and you're going to see much more of these. So literally, these are literally the poster children of the Genome Project. And what do you see as sort of headwinds, or you say we're a long way. What are some maybe 2 or 3 headwinds that you see? Yeah, so headwinds are really on the therapeutic side. I think, if I were to ask this audience, how much does it cost to develop a new drug?
I think the common answer most people give out, the lay audience would give out, it's $1 billion and it takes 10 years. I think there have been recent articles in Forbes that say that that is a gross underestimate. An underestimate. The real way to calculate this cost is just take pharma R&D dollars, divide by the number of drugs. It's very simple math. Pharma R&D divide by the number of new drugs. And if you do that math, it costs many companies between $4 and $12 billion to develop a new drug. And that's not sustainable. It's not sustainable. And so why is it not sustainable? Because the numerator is growing, the denominator is not changing. A lot of us in this audience in Silicon Valley trying to come up with ways to make the process more efficient, but at a certain point we're going to reach literally a cliff, and I think people call it the patent cliff in 2018, that so many drugs come off patent and become generic, which is a good thing for society. Don't get me wrong. We need to afford these drugs. All of us need to afford these drugs. But so many drugs come off patent, and so few new drugs are being able to be marketed that the pharma industry is projected to lose $250 billion of revenue in 2018. Not $250 billion, $250 billion. And so you have to sit there and wonder whether you love the pharma industry or hate the pharma industry. You wonder who's going to come up with the drugs here in this story when we have these kids with this one kid with the disease who's going to come up with the drugs. And the answer is it's going to be all of us. And we're going to just have to look at this and say it's unacceptable that it costs $1 billion to develop a drug. We're going to use every possible tool we can to make it more capitally efficient, whether it's software, whether it's public data. It's just what Silicon Valley is going to have to step up and do.
But isn't on one hand, aren't these new processes and therapeutics saving drug discovery money and companies in terms of the process itself and shortening the length? And on the other hand, you have issues with pricing, as you alluded to, and there's a current case, obviously, with Gilead hepatitis C that's being debated in Congress. So what's your, how does that play out?
Yeah, so what's happening is the reason why it does cost so much to develop these drugs is because the clinical trials process is super expensive. What is a clinical trial? It's the most expensive experiment in the world. We're testing to see if the drug works, if it's safe, if it works better than existing therapeutics, and half of clinical trials fail. Many of these drugs fail not because they're dangerous or have toxic effects, but it just, that drug didn't work for what we thought it was going to work. It doesn't meet its clinical endpoint. So one way to save that is to actually measure many more aspects about these patients in the trials, for example, the molecules and the DNA. And maybe the drug is working in the fraction of those patients, 25%, 50%. But if we know those markers, then maybe we can guide this drug to a particular therapy. And so there have been many of these kinds of drugs for precision medicine. There's a drug that came out 2 years ago, vemurafenib for malignant melanoma. And it's only good if you have melanoma with one particular DNA change. So you're going to have to get the melanoma, get the DNA measurement, and if it's there, then you're allowed to use this drug. I'm not going to talk about the Gilead case, but another case I love is the Vertex case. It's less controversial, but also more interesting. There's a new drug for cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis is a well-known genetic disease. It's in every ethnicity. Many people are carriers in any ethnicity. And so it's still a rare genetic disease. Kids have problems with their lungs, they have problems growing. And it's a rare disease, and here's a drug, Caldico, that is good for 4% of those kids, okay? So not even just a tiny amount of CS, but just 4% of them. And in some ways, to justify their cost of developing this drug, the cost of this drug is $250,000 per year, per patient, okay? So that one's not even controversial, actually. It's kind of interesting. It's not controversial. $250,000 per year. Now, you can make all sorts of strategic decisions based on that. All of a sudden, every farmer is thinking, what is our orphan disease strategy, right? That's a kind of cynical way to look at that. But at the same time, the real solution is shouldn't cost billions to develop these drugs. I think that's the real goal here.
Sure, and I think that's a huge debate that who knows how it will play out. I want to maybe move on to just some interesting companies you see out there in your space.
Yeah, so of course I'm sitting on the stage, so I'm going to talk about my companies first, right? That's what we have to do. So I'm not shy here, right? So when I think about it, I think of data being collected in a lot of different systems. I mentioned those two drivers. The data is getting pooled, and you got these reservoirs of data. So there's a lot of opportunities in thinking about the reservoirs of data and then how to move data from one place to another and actions that the data drives. So I'm involved with 3 particular companies, and I use these as examples of just where this data is going to go. The first of these is just following the $1,000 genome project, right? If we're talking down, it's going down to $0. What happened in 2008 is we realized at Stanford that someday someone, probably in this audience, is going to show up at Stanford with their genome in their hand, all right? And we weren't ready for this. So literally, in my lab, we just started with a Palo Alto high school kid, and I said, you know what, we need a database of just every spot, every misspelling in the genome. right? If this spelling is this way, then you might get this disease. We need a master list. So I just give them 50 papers. I said, read these 50 papers, curate them, read them, we'll put them in Excel. Let's see how long it takes you. And we did that, and we extrapolated. We realized, we could really solve this problem because there was no master database. So to fast forward, we hired a team in Pune, India, to just read the entire literature of genetics. Just read every single paper in human disease genetics, almost 20,000 papers. And if you fast forward now, we have the best list in the world. If it's spelled this way, we know which disease you're going to get. This, combined with other databases, 3 other faculty at Stanford, and then a well-known CEO who ran a sequencing company called Selexa, we realized we need to spin this out. We spun out a company called Personalis, funded by Abingworth, Lightspeed, and Mordavidoff. 2 years ago, we raised 20 million, and then last year we raised another 22 million. So 42 million already in for investors. And it's already public that we announced already 14 million in booked orders. Okay, right place, right time, starting with a Palo Alto high school kid. Okay, and we're talking 3 years, start to finish, to where we are today. That's one example. The data is there. The sequence is going to be $0. What do you do with all this data? You need to interpret this. It's a no-brainer. When you see the data is getting collected, what do you need to do with this? Second story we have is a little bit closer to my heart on the drug side. I refuse to believe it's going to have to keep costing $1 billion to develop these new drugs. What happens to these drugs when they go through clinical trials and fail? You have a safe drug that's sitting there in a pharmaceutical company. They even own the intellectual property, and then nobody wants to work on that drug. It's taboo. Stay away from this drug. It failed its trial. Go work on something else, otherwise that team is going to get let off. And so what we realized is that if we could figure out new uses for that drug and creatively do business development in licensing, we might be able to save those drugs and actually come up with more drugs for patients. So we started a company called NewMedi. I literally love the CEO. She's my wife, Ginny Deshpande. She's a really good CEO. She's on a flight somewhere, so I'm stuck here. And so what happens is we reposition off-patent drugs first, and then we're moving to these on-patent drugs that could get saved. So we raised $3 million just less than a year ago from Lightspeed and Claremont Creek, and then they're going strong. And a third one is even more vertical. Don't be afraid of being vertical, okay? You have to be very vertical in this space. And for that, people don't know what that means. You have to think about the need. I could try to sell you a platform. The sales cycles for these platforms are forever. Let me just sell you what I figured out with this platform, right? Here's the drug. Here's a diagnostic. Instead of you do it with these tools, right? Just take that step, figure out what the need is, and sell people that need, not just the platform to do themselves. So we did this for a company called Carmenta. It's just a third story. There's a disease that actually is common in Indians, but also many other cultures called preeclampsia. Blood pressure goes up during pregnancy. It's still the reason why husbands can lose wives around the world. Most Americans only heard of preeclampsia because they watched Downton Abbey. One of the characters dies from this particular condition, so that's the only reason why we know about this in America again. But it's a nasty disease. It falls between pediatrics and obstetricians. Nobody really studies this disease, unfortunately. We realized we could use public big data to suggest a new molecule that we could use for a blood test. We validated that with off-the-shelf samples. And then we got $2 million of seed investment also last year. So all of these were just funded last year. Matt Cooper is running that company. They're, both NewMedi and Carmenta are going to be going for their rounds, another round in the next few months. So the point here is to not just make it about a general purpose platform, figure out what you would want to do with this platform, and then take it that next step there.
Yeah, I mean, just quickly to end, because we have about one more minute, what maybe are some of the 2-3 things in terms of advice you would give to entrepreneurs or investors? We have a lot of investors, obviously, that are looking at this space.
So obviously, and I think most investors are looking at this space. As it gets more digital, it's amazing. There are more, IT, more tech investors getting into this space. I love that. I would just say, right off the top of my head, think of the true unmet need. We have many apps that take pictures of moles and rashes. We don't need more of those. Go a little bit deeper, figure out what is the true unmet need in all these fields. Where is the data? Where can you tap into it? What is working in healthcare and what doesn't work in healthcare, and who can figure that out the fastest and maybe add some intellectual property around it. I'm just going to end with the 7 big drivers, I think, moving things in this field now. I already mentioned the 2 of them, the molecular and personalized medicine. I mentioned data collection, the clinical systems, EHRs. The other 5 I would mention are patient organizations and ownership over conditions. It's amazing how patients can organize, patients like me, running their own trials of the future. Wellness and fitness. We talked about Fitbits, I think, in the previous panel. I'm a huge fan of Fitbit. 42 pounds I've lost in the past year because I have a Fitbit and a scale. Talk to me later about that. I just love that company and their products. Aging population with more chronic diseases, we're just going to have to address. We can't ignore that. Extreme push towards efficiency and reducing costs. It's one thing when the COO of your company says we need to cut our costs of goods sold. It's another thing when the President of the United States says we need to reduce the healthcare costs, right? You're talking double-digit GDP, right? Amazing efforts towards efficiency. And then new healthcare providers in this space, anywhere from Walgreens to Walmart. And these folks are both empowered by amazing new technologies like Theranos, which is on Page Mill Road, fingertip blood tests being deployed in Walgreens. I'm looking at all these. I just have to smile. It's just going to be amazing next 5 years in healthcare and IT.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.